Okay, so today we're going to talk about convolutional neural networks, which is basically the same sort of idea, but now we're going to learn about convolutional layers that reason on top of basically explicitly trying to maintain spatial structure. So let's first talk a little bit about the history of neural networks and then also how convolutional neural networks were developed. So we can go all the way back to 1957 with Frank Rosenblatt, who developed the Mark I perceptron machine, which was the first implementation of an algorithm called the perceptron, which had sort of the similar idea of getting score functions, right, using some w times x plus a bias. But here the outputs are going to be either 1 or a 0. And then in this case, we have an update rule. So an update rule for our weights W, which also look kind of similar to the type of update rule that we're also seeing in backprop. But in this case, there was no principled backpropagation technique yet. We just sort of took the weights and adjusted them in the direction towards the target that we wanted. So in 1960, we had Woodrow and Hoff, who developed Adeline and Madeline, which was the first time that we were able to get to stack these linear layers into multi-layer perceptron networks. And so this is starting to now look kind of like this idea of neural network layers, but we still didn't have backprop or any sort of principled way to train this. And so the first time backprop was really introduced was in 1986 with Rumelhart. And so here we can start seeing these kinds of equations with the chain rule and the update rules that we're starting to get familiar with, right? And so this is the first time we started to have a principled way to train these kinds of network architectures. And so after that, it still wasn't able to scale to very large neural networks. And so there's sort of a period in which there wasn't a whole lot of new things happening here or a lot of popular use of these kinds of networks. And so this really started being reinvigorated around the 2000s. So in 2006, there was this paper by Jeff Hinton and Ruslan Salukudinov, which basically showed that we could train a deep neural network and show that we could do this effectively. But it was still not quite the sort of modern iteration of neural networks. It required really careful initialization in order to be able to do backprop. And so what they had here was they would have this first pre-training stage where you model each hidden layer through a restricted Boltzmann machine. And so you're going to get some initialized weights by training each of these layers iteratively. And so once you get all of these hidden layers, you then use that to initialize your full neural network, and then from there you do backprop and fine tuning of that. And so when we really started to get the first really strong results using neural networks, and what sort of really sparked the whole craze of starting to use these kinds of networks really widely was at around 2000, 2012, where we had first the strongest results using for speech recognition. And so this is work out of Jeff Hinton's lab for acoustic modeling and speech recognition. And then for image recognition, 2012 was the landmark paper from Alex Krzyzewski in Jeff Hinton's lab, which introduced the first convolutional neural network architecture that was able to get really strong results on ImageNet classification. And so it took the ImageNet image classification benchmark and was able to dramatically reduce the error on that benchmark. And so since then, ComNets have gotten really widely used in all kinds of applications. So now let's step back and take a look at what gave rise to convolutional neural networks specifically. And so we can go back to the 1950s, where Hubel and Wiesel did a series of experiments trying to understand how neurons in the visual cortex worked. And they studied this specifically for cats. And so we talked a little bit about this in lecture 1. But basically in these experiments, they put electrodes in the cat, into the cat brain, and they gave the cat different visual stimulus, right? And so things like different kinds of edges, oriented edges, different sorts of shapes, and they measured the response of the neurons to these stimuli. And so there were a couple of important conclusions that they were able to make and observations. And so the first thing they found that there's sort of this topographical mapping in the cortex. So nearby cells in the cortex also represent nearby regions in the visual field. And so you can see, for example, on the right here, where if you take kind of the spatial mapping and map this onto a visual cortex, there's more peripheral regions are these blue areas, farther away from the center. And so they also discovered that these neurons had a hierarchical organization. And so if we look at different types of visual stimuli, they were able to find that at the earliest layers, retinal ganglion cells were responsive to things that looked kind of like circular regions of spots. And then on top of that, there are simple cells. And these simple cells are responsive to oriented edges, so different orientation of the light stimulus. And then going further, they discovered that these were then connected to more complex cells, which were responsive to both light orientation as well as movement, and so on. And you get, increasing complexity. For example, hypercomplex cells are now responsive to movement with kind of an endpoint, right? And so now you're starting to get the idea of corners and then blobs and so on. And so then in 1980, the neocognitron was the first example of a network architecture, a model that had this idea of simple and complex cells that Hubel and Wiesel had discovered. And in this case, Fukushima put these into these alternating layers of simple and complex cells, where you had these simple cells that had modifiable parameters, and then complex cells on top of these that performed this sort of pooling, so that it was invariant to different minor modifications from the simple cells. And so this is work that was in the 1980s, right? And so by 1998, Jan LeCun basically showed the first example of applying backpropagation and gradient-based learning to train convolutional neural networks that did really well on document recognition. And specifically, they were able to do a good job of recognizing digits of zip codes. And so these were then used pretty widely for zip code recognition in the Postal Service. But beyond that, it wasn't able to scale yet to more challenging and complex data. Right? Digits are still fairly simple and a limited set to recognize. And so this is where Alex Krzyzewski in 2012 gave the modern incarnation of convolutional neural networks. And his network we sort of colloquially call AlexNet. But this network really didn't look so much different than the convolutional neural networks that Jan LeCun was dealing with. They're now, they were scaled now to be larger and deeper and able to, the most important parts were that they were now able to take advantage of the large amount of data that's now available, in web images, in the ImageNet data set, as well as take advantage of the parallel computing power in GPUs. And so we'll talk more about that later. But fast forwarding today, so now ComNets are used everywhere, and so we have the initial classification results on ImageNet from Alex Krzyzewski. This is able to do a really good job of image retrieval. You can see that when we're trying to retrieve a flower, for example, the features that are learned are really powerful for doing similarity matching. We also have ComNets that are used for detection, so we're able to do a really good job of localizing where in an image is, for example, a bus or a boat and so on, and draw precise bounding boxes around that. We're able to go even deeper beyond that to do segmentation, right? So these are now richer tasks where we're not looking for just the bounding box, but we're actually going to label every pixel and the outline of trees and people and so on. And these kind of algorithms are used in, for example, self-driving cars. And a lot of this is powered by GPUs, as I mentioned earlier, that's able to do parallel processing and able to efficiently train and run these ComNets. And so, we have modern, powerful GPUs, as well as ones that work in embedded systems, for example, that you would use in a self-driving car. So we can also look at some of the other applications that ComNets are used for. So face recognition, right? We can put an input image of a face and get out a likelihood of who this person is. ComNets are applied to video. And so this is an example of a video network that looks at both images as well as temporal information, and from there is able to classify videos. We're also able to do pose recognition, being able to recognize, shoulders, elbows, and different joints. And so here are some images of our fabulous TA Lane in various kinds of pretty non-standard human poses. But ComNets are able to do a pretty good job of pose recognition these days. They're also used in game playing. So some of the work in reinforcement learning, deep reinforcement learning that you may have seen, playing Atari games, and Go, and so on. And ComNets are an important part of all of these. Some other applications. So they're being used for interpretation and diagnosis of medical images, for classification of galaxies, for street sign recognition. There's also whale recognition. This is from a recent Kaggle challenge. We also have examples of looking at aerial maps and being able to draw out where are the streets on these maps, where are buildings, and being able to segment all of these. And then beyond recognition of classification, detection, these types of tasks, we also have tasks like image captioning, where given an image, we want to write a sentence description about what's in the image. And so this is something that we'll go into a little bit more later in the class. And we also have really, really fancy and cool kind of artwork that we can do using neural networks. And so on the left is an example of Deep Dream, where we're able to take images and kind of hallucinate different kinds of objects and concepts in the image. There's also neural style type work where we take an image and we're able to re-render this image using a style of a particular artist and artwork, right? And so here we can take, for example, Van Gogh on the right, Starry Night, and use that to redraw our original image using that style. And Justin has done a lot of work in this, and so if you guys are interested, these are images produced by some of his code, and you guys should talk to him more about it. Okay, so basically, this is just a small sample of where ComNets are being used today, but there's really a huge amount that can be done with this, right? And so, for your guys' projects, sort of, let your imagination go wild, and we're excited to see what sorts of applications you can come up with. So today we're going to talk about how convolutional neural networks work. And again, same as with neural networks, we're going to first talk about how they work from a functional perspective without any of the brain analogies, and then we'll talk briefly about some of these connections. Okay, so last lecture, we talked about this idea of a fully connected layer. And how, for a fully connected layer, what we're doing is we operate on top of these vectors, right? And so let's say we have, an image, 3D image, 32 by 32 by 3. So some of the images that we were looking at previously, we'll take that, we'll stretch all of the pixels out, right? And then we have this 3072 dimensional vector, for example, in this case. And then we have these weights, right? So we're going to multiply this by a weight matrix. And so here, for example, our W, we're going to say is 10 by 3072. And then we're going to get the activations, the output of this layer, right? And so in this case, we take each of our 10 rows, and we do this dot product with the 3072 dimensional input. And from there, we get this one number that's kind of the value of that neuron. And so in this case, we're going to have 10 of these neuron outputs. And so a convolutional layer, so the main difference between this and the fully connected layer that we've been talking about is that here we want to preserve spatial structure. And so taking this 32 by 32 by 3 image that we had earlier, instead of stretching this all out into one long vector, we're now going to keep the structure of this image, right, this three-dimensional input. And then what we're going to do is our weights are going to be these small filters. So in this case, for example, a 5 by 5 by 3 filter. And we're going to take this filter and we're going to slide it over the image spatially and compute dot products at every spatial location. And so we're going to go into detail of how exactly this works. So our filters, first of all, always extend the full depth of the input volume. And so they're going to be just a smaller spatial area, so in this case 5 by 5, right, instead of our full 32 by 32 spatial input, but they're always going to go through the full depth, right? So here we're going to take 5 by 5 by 3. And then we're going to take this filter, and at a given spatial location, we're going to do a dot product between this filter and then a chunk of the image. So we're just going to overlay this filter on top of a spatial location in the image, right? And then do the dot product, the multiplication of each element of that filter with each corresponding element in that spatial location that we've just plopped it on top of. And then this is going to give us a dot product. So in this case, we have 5 times 5 times 3. This is the number of multiplications that we're going to do, right? Plus a bias term. And so this is basically taking our filter W and basically doing W transpose times X and plus bias. So is that clear how this works? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, when we do the dot product, do we turn the 5 by 5 by 3 into one vector? Yeah, and in essence, that's what you're doing. You can think of it as just popping it on and doing the element-wise multiplication at each location, but this is going to give you the same result as if you stretched out the filter at that point, stretched out the input volume that it's laid over, and then took the dot product. And that's what's written here. Yeah, question? Oh, this is, so the question is, any intuition for why this is a W transpose? And this was just, not really, this is just the notation that we have here to make the math work out as a dot product. So it just depends on how you're representing W and whether, in this case, if we look at the W matrix, this happens to be each column, and so we're just taking the transpose to get a row out of it. But there's no intuition here. We're just taking the filters of W and we're stretching it out into a 1D vector. And in order for it to be a dot product, it has to be like a 1 by n vector. Okay, so the question is W here not 5 by 5 by 3? It's 1 by 75. So that's the case, right? If we're going to do this dot product of W transpose times X, we have to stretch it out first before we do the dot product. So we take the 5 by 5 by 3, and we just take all these values and stretch it out into a long vector. And so again, similar to the other question, the actual operation that we're doing here is plopping our filter on top of a spatial location in the image and multiplying all the corresponding values together. But in order just to make it kind of an easy expression similar to what we've seen before, we can also just stretch each of these out, make sure that like dimensions are transposed correctly so that it works out as a dot product. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, how do we slide the filter over the image? We'll go into that next. Okay, so the question is, should we rotate the kernel by 180 degrees to better match the convolution, the definition of a convolution? And so the answer is that we'll also show the equation for this later, but we're using convolution as kind of a looser definition of what's happening. So for people from signal processing, what we are actually technically doing, if you want to call this a convolution, is we're convolving with the flipped version of the filter. But for the most part, we just don't worry about this, and we just do this operation, and it's like a convolution in spirit. Okay, so we had a question earlier. How do we slide this over all the spatial locations? Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this filter. We're going to start at the upper left-hand corner and basically center our filter on top of every pixel in this input volume. And at every position, we're going to do this dot product, and this will produce one value in our output activation map. And so then we're going to just slide this around. the simplest version is just at every pixel, we're going to do this operation and fill in the corresponding point in our output activation. You can see here that the dimensions are not exactly what would happen, right? If you're going to do this, I had 32 by 32 in the input, and I'm having 28 by 28 in the output. And so we'll go into examples later of the math of exactly how this is going to work out dimension-wise. But basically, you have a choice of how you're going to slide this, whether you go at every pixel or whether you slide, let's say, two input values over at a time, 2 pixels over at a time. And so you can get different sized outputs depending on how you choose to slide. But you're basically doing this operation in a grid fashion. Okay, so what we just saw earlier, this is taking one filter, sliding it over all of the spatial locations in the image, and then we're going to get this activation map out, right, which is the value of that filter at every spatial location. And so when we're dealing with a convolutional layer, we want to work with multiple filters, right? Because each filter is kind of looking for a specific type of template or concept in the input volume. And so we're going to have a set of multiple filters. And so here I'm going to take a second filter, this green filter, which is again 5 by 5 by 3. I'm going to slide this over all of the spatial locations in my input volume. And then I'm going to get out this second green activation map, also of the same size. And we can do this for as many filters as we want to have in this layer. So for example, if we have 6 filters, 6 of these 5 by 5 filters, then we're going to get in total 6 activation maps out. So we're going to get this output volume that's going to be basically 6 by 28 by 28. Right, and so a preview of how we're going to use these convolutional layers in our convolutional network is that our ConvNet is basically going to be a sequence of these convolutional layers stacked on top of each other, same way as what we had with the simple linear layers in their neural network. And then we're going to intersperse these with activation functions. So for example, a ReLU activation function. Right, and so you're going to get something like ReLU, and usually also some pooling layers, and then you're just going to get a sequence of these, each creating an output that's now going to be the input to the next convolutional layer.
이번 시간에는 컨볼루셔널 뉴럴 네트워크에 대해서 알아보도록 하겠습니다. 지난 시간에는 뉴럴 네트워크의 기초에 대해서 배웠습니다. 리니어 스코어 펑션에 대해서 배웠고 투-레이어 뉴럴 네트워크에 대해서 배웠습니다. 여기서 wx는 리니어 펑션이지만 max는 non-linear 펑션입니다. 아래 그림들은 클래스의 템플릿들을 표현하고 있는데 투-레이어 뉴럴 네트워크에서는 이러한 템플릿들을 컴바인해서 파이널 스코어를 계산할 수 있었습니다. 컨볼루션의 뉴럴 네트워크의 기본 개념도 이와 같습니다. 인풋을 컨볼루션을 통해서 이미지 맵을 만들고 이를 섭샘플링한 뒤 fully connected 레이어를 통해서 아웃풋 스코어를 계산해냅니다. 뉴럴 네트워크의 역사는 상당히 오래되어서 이미 1957년에 퍼셉트론의 개념이 있었습니다. 1960년에는 멀티레이어 퍼셉트론 네트워크가 제안되었습니다. 1986년에는 처음으로 백프로퍼게이션과 체인룰이 퍼퓰러하게 되었습니다. 뉴럴 네트워크는 의미 있는 성과를 내지 못하다가 2006년에 이르러서 힌튼의 연구를 통해서 큰 주목을 받기 시작합니다. 힌튼의 연구는 우리가 딥 뉴럴 네트워크를 트레이닝하는 것이 가능하다는 것을 보여주었습니다. 그러나 힌튼의 연구 결과는 한계점들을 갖고 있었기 때문에 본격적으로 주목을 받기 시작한 것은 2010년과 2012년도부터입니다. 힌튼 교수 랩에서는 2010년도에는 딥 빌리프 네트워크를 사용해서 어쿠스틱 모델링과 스피치 레코그니션에서 큰 연구 성과를 거두었습니다. 2012년에는 딥 컨볼루셔널 뉴럴 네트워크를 사용해서 이미지넷 클래시피케이션에서 충격적인 연구 결과를 만들어내었습니다. 이를 계기로 컨볼루셔널 뉴럴 네트워크는 널리 알려지게 되었고 이제는 학계뿐 아니라 산업계에서도 널리 응용되고 있습니다. 그러나 힌턴이 모든 것을 혼자 해낸 것은 아닙니다. 1980년 후쿠시마는 Modifiable Parameter와 풀링에 대한 개념을 제안했습니다. 1998년에 러크는 Gradient Based Learning을 Document Recognition에 적용했습니다. 이러한 연구들을 바탕으로 2012년에 크리첵스키와 힌트는 Deep Convolutional Neural Network을 사용하여 이미지넷 클래시피케이션을 성공적으로 수행할 수 있었습니다. 현재 컨브넷은 여러 곳에서 응용되고 있습니다. 클래시피케이션 사례를 보면 Might, Container Ship, 모르스코를, 레오파드를 매우 정확하게 분류해내고 있습니다. 반면에 자동차 앞면의 그릴을 컨버터블로 분류하고 체리를 달마시안계로 잘못 분류했지만 이는 나름대로의 합리적 이유를 갖고 있습니다. 한편 이미지 리트리버에서는 컨브넷이 시뮬라리티 매칭에 잘 활용될 수 있음을 보여줍니다. 컨브넷은 이미지에서 오브젝트를 디텍션하는 데도 활용될 수 있습니다. 예를 들면 왼쪽 이미지들에서 사람, 말, 고양이, 버스 등의 오브젝트들을 디텍션 해내는 것을 볼 수 있습니다. 이때 바운딩 박스는 각 오브젝트의 경계선을 표시하는데 서로 영역이 겹칠 수 있습니다. 오른쪽의 세그멘테이션은 바운딩 박스를 넘어서서 이미지를 세그멘트하는 것입니다. 이러한 컴포넌트를 구현하기 위해서는 엔비디아의 테슬라 라인 같은 병렬 처리 GPU에 강력한 하드웨어들이 필요합니다. 컴포넌트는 2014년에는 타이그만 등에 의해서 페이스 레코그니션이 발표되었고 시모니안 등에 의해서는 스페셜 스트림과 템포럴 스트림을 처리하는 비디오를 클래시피케이션 하는 것이 발표되었습니다. 또한 디포메이션 문제를 해결하기 위해 포즈 레코그니션이 발표되었고 Reinforcement Learning을 이용한 비디오 게임을 플레이하는 것이 발표되었습니다. 2016년에는 컨브넷을 사용하여 메디컬 이미지를 인터프리테이션하고 다이그노시스 하는 것이 발표되었는데 현재는 많은 의료기관에서 이를 사용하고 있습니다. 또한 컨브넷은 갤럭시 클래시피케이션과 스트리트 사인 레코그니션에도 활용되고 있습니다. 다음 사례들은 왼쪽은 캐글 챌린지에서 나온 웨일, 고래를 레코그니션하는 것이고 오른쪽 사진은 공중 사진으로부터 도시의 거리와 집들을 세그멘테이션 하도록 한 것입니다. 오브젝트 디텍션을 넘어서 이미지 캡셔닝까지도 시도할 수 있습니다. 주어진 사례에서는 캡셔닝이 no 에러인 경우, 마이너 에러인 경우, somewhat related된 경우로 나누어 지시되어 있습니다. 이미지 캡셔닝을 잘하기 위해서는 이미지의 컨텍스트를 알아야 되기 때문에 이는 인공지능에 있어서 대단히 어려운 문제입니다. 뉴럴 네트워크는 아트의 스타일을 만들어내는 데도 활용될 수 있습니다. 본 사례에서는 건물 사진으로부터 고호의 별이 빛나는 밤의 아트 스타일을 비롯한 3개의 다른 스타일로 그림을 그린 것을 볼 수 있습니다. 다음에는 컨볼루셔널 뉴럴 네트워크에 대해서 기능적 관점에서 살펴보도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째 단계에서는 인풋 이미지를 벡터로 스트레칭합니다. 본 예제에서는 32 곱하기 32 픽셀의 3개의 RGB 이미지를 3072 곱하기 1의 벡터로 전환한 것입니다. 이러한 인풋 벡터에 웨이트 매트릭스를 곱하여 액티베이션 벡터를 얻도록 합니다. 본 사례의 경우에는 10개의 클래스가 있기 때문에 액티베이션 벡터는 10개의 엘리먼트를 갖고 있습니다. 액티베이션의 각 엘리먼트는 웨이트 매트릭스 W의 로우와 인풋의 더 프로덕트를 수행하여 구할 수 있습니다. 이번에는 풀리 커넥티드 레이어가 아니라 컨볼루션 레이어에 대해서 알아보도록 하겠습니다. 여기서 5 곱하기 5 곱하기 3의 작은 필터를 사용해서 인풋 이미지를 컨볼브 하도록 합니다. 여기서 컨볼브의 의미는 이미지를 약간씩 슬라이드 오버 이동시키면서 덧 프로덕트를 계산하는 것입니다. 여기서 RGB 색을 표현하는 인풋 이미지의 depth 3과 필터의 depth 3은 같은 값을 가지도록 합니다. 인풋 이미지에 필터 W를 적용하여 하나의 숫자를 구할 수 있는데 이를 식으로 표현하면 W 트랜스포즈 곱하기 X에 바이어스 B를 더한 것입니다. 이러한 필터를 모든 스페셜 로케이션에 슬라이드 오버하면 액티베이션 맵이 만들어집니다. 액티베이션 맵의 크기는 28 곱하기 28 곱하기 1이 됩니다. 액티베이션 맵의 크기가 인풋에서 4만큼 줄은 이유는 컨볼브를 수행하는 데 있어서 5 빼기 1, 즉 4만큼의 마진이 필요하기 때문입니다. 이번에는 두 번째 필터를 사용해서 또 다른 액티베이션 맵을 만들었습니다. 본 사례에서는 이러한 방법으로 6개의 액티베이션 맵들을 만들었습니다. 이는 아키텍처에 따라서 달라질 수 있습니다. 컨볼루션 넷은 결국 이러한 컨볼루션 레이어들의 시퀀스로 볼 수 있습니다. 액티베이션 펑션들은 여기저기 산재되어 있습니다. 본 사례에서는 또 다른 컨볼루션 레이어를 통해서 24 곱하기 24 곱하기 10의 액티베이션 맵들이 만들어진 것을 볼 수 있습니다. 다음 시간에는 컨볼루션 넷에 대해서 더 자세히 알아보도록 하겠습니다.